Liam's so excited to be on the show tonight that he's already in chat. What's up, man? We'll be dragging him in here in a minute. What is up, everybody? Average People Talking live on a Sunday night for a hot topic. And not the store that you went to as a teenager and still occasionally walk in for nostalgia. I think this is one of my favorite stream beats. This one's kind of thickums. All right. I am kind of fired up today. Oh, wait. I forgot. Oh, my glare. That's better. And my random open cabinets. That looks better, right? Oh, hey, thanks. Wifey says yes. We're in good shape. We're in good shape. Tonight's topic is kind of a thick one. It's kind of a heavy one, but it's essentially we're going to talk about what I call the opinion shield. And other people have called it that as well. But it's essentially when somebody's got a disagreement with you, you're going back and forth, you get into that heat of the moment discussion, and out of nowhere, they just give themselves the convenient bailout. You're making some good points, you got them on the ropes, and then they're like, well, this is my opinion. The forgetfulness to shave has Liam excited. It's really all this is here, but why it's frustrating when somebody does this and throws the opinion shield in the middle of a discussion. It's for a number of reasons, but the biggest reason is there's a problem with unjustified beliefs. So I want to clarify something. When we're talking about the opinion shield, I have a pretty strict belief on this. Opinions are like, I like chocolate. I don't like vanilla. I enjoy rap music. I like rap music. I dislike country music. The opinions have to do with your subjective experience of something. However, anytime you make a claim outside of your purely subjective experience, there becomes objective ways to disagree with it. So what do I mean? I mean, if you say, this is the one Liam and I get into a lot with people. If you say something is good or bad, like let's say your opinion is Eminem is a bad rapper. There's a right and a wrong answer to that question. Obviously, the answer is you're wrong, and get out of my stream. You cannot like Eminem. Liam is incorrect in chat right now. Obviously, this is going to get spicy later when we bring him in. There is a objective measure to what it means to be a good or bad rapper. Now, there is a case where you can have an opinion on a topic like this where it's not really clear how to come up with a path to a right answer. But you should be willing to admit that you're doing so on bad information. You should be willing to admit that you're doing so somewhat on faith, as it were. That you think you'll be correct, that you know you're not justified in what you're currently saying, but you think you'll be correct. So the problem with unjustified beliefs about anything is when the stakes get higher. So if you say it's just my opinion, you're demonstrating you don't care to justify what your belief is or what your position is. And the problem is, again, like I said, it means you don't know. It's just what you believe. There's this philosophical difference of what it means to have a knowledge of something versus just a belief about something. Your belief may be true, but if you can't justify that belief, it's simply an accident that you're right. To have knowledge, to know the answer, to be correct, is to have a justified true belief. It's not enough to just be right. You have to know, for me. There's that famous quote from Bertrand Russell that there are two kinds of people in this world, those who want to know and those who want to believe. And that's something I feel really, really strongly. I definitely fall in the camp of somebody who wants to know. That's the main point of this podcast. It's the main point of the pursuit of knowledge and truth. It's not good enough for me. I like finding out that I'm wrong about something because it gives me the opportunity to fix it and correct it. And I relish in those moments. It's a lot of fun when you get to find something that you've been thinking for a long time and believing, and it turns out that you weren't correct due to whatever information you discover. And most of the times, and this is true for those that are actually seeking it, most of the times that comes from listening to good arguments or counter arguments. Now, what I think has happened in the modern world is the only time we listen to these counter arguments, we're not willing to hear them from the people in our lives that we're closest to. This is the old, you can't talk about politics or religion. When things get too contentious between people or we have a disagreement, we think our friends aren't experts on anything or can't possibly know things, or don't have special privilege to information over us. And we tend to negate their opinions when it disagrees with our more deeply held beliefs, which I'm going to talk about tonight, why that is and what this kind of tribalism is, and why I think there's some devastating consequences with that. And that's part of why I want to have Liam involved in the discussion tonight, because I think there's some really interesting topics that kind of go along with that. But what I mean specifically is we live in a day of podcasts and YouTube and authors and experts. And so unless there's a PhD who gives you the information, whom you already have some trust established with, if something you hear disagrees with what you currently believe, most people tend to be more skeptical towards that new information. And what I want to suggest is that's the wrong kind of skepticism. The skepticism you should have is about your own belief and whether or not it's actually justified, because that's a counter argument that's starting to sound somewhat convincing. And just because it's not being uttered by an expert that you already have trust with or validation with doesn't mean that it's not true. I mean, it could literally be, anybody making the counter argument. If the counter argument corrects a position or a belief that you have, it doesn't matter who said it. You're just wrong at that point. I mean, that's what the Socratic method dictates. Why does all of this matter? So, it matters because, again, I think there's some really big consequences that we have. I put out a Snapchat earlier this week, and ultimately a Facebook post that I shared with it. And I actually got some honestly surprising pushback on it that I didn't expect. The reason I didn't expect it was because I really felt like what I was saying was really correct. I'm going to pull this up here because I think it's important. But this is what I sent out a snap and then I shared this on my social media. But it was food for thought. At bottom, All our struggles and disagreements as society, and even interpersonally, come down to fundamental philosophical differences. And when you have those, it requires argument to resolve. And it requires argument because to get at knowledge, the best method known is the Socratic method. You have to provide your reasons and your evidence that proves your reasons. And if it holds up to all counter arguments, well, then you know you've got a justified, true belief. When it doesn't, that's an indication that you either need to go back and make a better argument, find better reasons, find more evidence for your position. The reverse is if it fails, you should accept whatever new position is now available to you by the counter argument. And this is really the method at correcting false beliefs that I think is missing. Part of the problem is we don't even learn this in school anymore, really. I mean, philosophy is not taught. No one seems to care how we know. We just kind of move through life at 1 minute long intervals with TikTok and Snapchat. We don't really think about anything anymore. And yet this method that I'm talking about is the root of truly all human knowledge. This is how we know things. Science is predicated on it. The PH in PhD stands for philosophy for a reason. It's this at bottom getting to the root of things that's going to get us out of these problems. We have to have these arguments, and we have to be willing to accept when the right argument is there to solve some of the bigger problems we have in society. But what are we doing? We're not doing that. Instead of resolving those differences and addressing these fundamental problems, we give up 10 minutes in. We think it's too difficult to talk about. We'd rather just not offend anybody or be offended ourselves, and we throw it in. So think about, like, let's take a big societal problem like acceptance of various different LGBTQ people. Okay? This ultimately comes down to some philosophical questions about what you believe about ethical systems, what you believe about culture, and what you believe about science. You know, if you believe that ethical systems necessarily rely on a god to tell us what's right and wrong, and we don't resolve that problem, because I don't want to offend you, accept your view of how morality works, and which is essentially your value theory, I'll never solve the problem underneath the problem. I might get you to compromise. I might get you to accept temporarily that somebody who is LGBTQ can live down the street from you and have the same rights in society. But underneath of it, you're still going to think that their lifestyle is wrong because we haven't solved the philosophical problem about ethical systems underneath of it. Culture. This is, when it comes to gender issues, was gender invented by culture? Are there cultures where gender was never invented or gender was invented differently? What you believe about that is a philosophical difference, whether or not you think gender is a real thing or a cultural construct. The difference in that belief, if we just give up on it and you're like, okay, I'll just call you whatever you want. You haven't convinced me of anything, but, I just want to not offend. We're not actually solving the problem. We're not getting anywhere. We're just continually to divide each other more and more by not resolving this. And then you get to even bigger issues still, like economic issues, right? The biggest philosophical difference, I think, between most people is what you believe about private property. You'll hear conservatives and libertarians often rail on forever about private property rights. They love to talk about private property rights and how important it is. And my biggest criticism on the left is not holding their feet to the fire on private property, because philosophically, their argument doesn't hold up. There is no justification for the concept of private property. The argument's been made, and really hasn't been refuted in any way that's convincing. Therefore, we know that somebody doesn't have a fundamental right to claim a piece of the earth as their own, yet we keep operating as though this isn't the real problem underneath all of our other economic issues. We keep operating like we can fix this with tweaks around the edges. I don't think so. I think ultimately this is going to be our undoing until we accept what's true about these things and then do something with what that true information reveals. This follows kind of the same concept from racial issues, right? Being able to sort out racial issues come down to being able to accept that race was a product of cultural invention. It's not real. It doesn't have any scientific justification. It just doesn't even make sense. So what do we do about that? There is such a thing as not race. This is my biggest problem with Ibram X. Kendi. And it's like, I agree with a lot of what he's trying to do, and I agree with the goal, right, of fighting back forever on all this racism that's existed for forever, right? However, until we've solved the philosophical problem, one of the things that he says is there's no such thing as a not racist. You're either racist or anti-racist. Well, the problem with that, for me, with Kendi, is that there is such a thing as not race, and that's actually representative reality. We made race up. And I think we should do our best to unmake race instead of doubling down on it. And that's my problem with his approach, is I think it can relieve some temporary suffering. I don't think it will solve the problem underneath of it, of how to get at the knowledge that's underneath of it that can really help us. So obviously all these biggest problems that we have in society, whether it be economics issues and cultural issues and these culture wars that you see on our news channels and the opinion pages, which obviously the fact that there's something called an opinion TV show is going to be relevant tonight and something we're thinking about. They're all philosophical issues, but people want to just bury their head in the sand, not have to think about it, say it's not my problem, I have my opinion, and you can fuck off. And that's what they do. They don't want to deal with any of this because it's hard. And the reason why I think it's hard, Julia Galef talks about this. So Julia Galef wrote a book called The Scout Mindset that was just released in 2021, but she did a TED Talk back in 2015 about the same topic. She's been on all kinds of discussions with a lot of my favorite thinkers. She is a direct follower of Peter Singer, as I am myself, and the effective altruism movement. She's went on Coleman Hughes' show when the book came out and talked about the problem of identity. You'll actually find my more recent episode about identity labels and the problem with those identity labels to be very reminiscent of some of the things that she talks about. Julia Galef talks about this scout mindset. There's a difference between soldiers and scouts. A lot of people spend most of their time operating with a soldier's mindset, which is I'm part of a tribe, my beliefs are part of my identity, that identity is tied to my tribe, and I must defend them. They're not as open to counter-argument. They're not as open to new ideas. And this is an important cognitive bias that I think is really holding a lot of people back. It makes them defensive when somebody brings up counter-information instead of open to it. The opposite of that is the scout. And the scout is very, very important in an army. There are times where you need to be a soldier, but those are rare and few and far between. There are much more times where you need to be a scout and gather the correct information. The scout is more open-minded, wants to gain information, really see reality for what it is. What does that battlefield look like? Is there a way to bridge the river? Is there a place where we could be ambushed? Is there threats from the topography? Is there an encampment that we weren't aware of? The scout is there to find that critical information and deliver that correct information back to the leaders. The flip side of that for the soldiers is they don't have time to think about all of that. They're following orders. They're there to do the fighting in defense of the position, right? The problem is when we're talking about trying to find knowledge and trying to find out what's right and true, that tribalism and that identity obscure our ability to reason effectively. And when we're not reasoning effectively, we're not going to get to the real issues. We have real issues. We have some serious conflicts in society. private property rights and what to do about them. So many billionaires get defended day in and day out by the vast majority of society because of bad ideas about what it means to own private property and whether or not someone has a right to it. And that conflict is becoming an ever more serious threat when you're talking about the largest wealth disparity in American history. There are only two ways out of a conflict. We can either have a conversation about it or it will lead to violence. And the stakes have really never been higher. Let's not forget that probably one of the biggest threats, climate change, is going to be all of our problem before long, whether you're a billionaire or poor. Climate change is a very, very real threat. I was just reading an article this week. There's a survey going down to check out one of the bigger glaciers down in the Antarctic, because it's fractured in such a way where if it continues to melt and it breaks apart, it could by itself raise sea levels by 2 feet. That's going to cause massive, 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 massive problems and displace a lot of people out of their homes, cause a lot of damage. This is a real human cost. So the stakes have never been higher for these conflicts, and we can't even agree about climate change because some people still are stuck on the philosophical idea that a God exists, and because they think God likes to write books, climate change doesn't fit into the brilliant scientific positions written down in the Bible, which we all know to be nonsense. I mean, the Bible talks about a global flood and somebody putting 2 of every animal on a boat. So, like, a book that clearly was written by people who knew nothing about science, some people think was written by the creator of the universe. And many of those people hold positions of massive power in our society. We got to fix that. We have to solve this. And we have to hold people's feet to the fire and be willing to address this and not just play nice all the time, or we never get out of it and we're doomed. The stakes are really that high. However, the light is that I do think we can have effective conversations about it. It's part of why those are the kind of people I surround myself with in my life. I really enjoy having these kinds of discussions. It's why I started this podcast. There are times where I have disagreed with, there are actually times to this day where I disagree with something that my wife and I see differently on. And yet part of the reason why I love her is she's willing to have a conversation with me forever until one of us, moves. Those kinds of things can save us. Getting out of our soldier-like defense of our opinions and dropping our opinion shield and allowing ourselves to be open to reason, open to counter-argument, open to better evidence. That can really save us and pull us out of this quagmire. So I like to do that. Those are conversations that I like to have. I want to bring in Liam now and talk about his take on everything that I just said, since he's been here listening to most of it and now joining us. Liam, welcome back to Average People Talking. How you doing, my friend?
Hey, long time it's been. How's it going, friend?
It has been going well. It has been going well.
Good to hear. Happy to be back on the show, man.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I was kind of listening to a lot of what she said, and obviously we'll get into it. But one thing that I've kind of had on my mind, and it's something that you brought up earlier in your speech there, but it's something you and I have talked a lot about. And as far as the opinion shield goes, obviously when it comes to a debate setting, it's, a tool that is annoying and furthermore destructive to the human race, which I think we both agree on. But I think we've also talked a lot about maintaining the social order. And that's one thing that I've also thought a lot about that I'm not quite solid on yet. But, you and I have been in a lot of settings where we have a lot of people with differing opinions, and we found that oftentimes that it can be quite intense and what's the word for it? Disruptive to discourse when it comes to the games we're playing and stuff like that, the communities we're in. Whenever we have these disagreements and we discuss them, and I guess I'm kind of curious to hear about what you think about that in general, because I think this is a better setting for it. Obviously, I think maintaining the social order can be more important than some of those discussions.
Yeah. So it can be, and there are certainly times to not have these kinds of discussions. The problem I see, and the reason why I sent out that snap, I think it was like Monday or Tuesday. I was in one of those particularly insightful moods in the morning.
Yeah, it's like the day after some shit went down.
Yeah. The real problem is how we think, right? And that's why I kind of brought up the whole thing that Julia Galef talks about, because it's like, what are we going to do to get out of the biggest problems facing ourselves? And the reason why people are willing to throw the opinion shield in, the reason why people get mad, is because their approach is the soldier mindset, right? They have made certain beliefs essential to their identity because they take on identity labels that they think really mean something to them. There was a time when Republican and Democrat were such labels. I think that there's enough self-party hate that those probably don't hold up anymore. So people have embraced more liberal and conservative. But even the people who don't put a word to it, they do tend to wrap certain beliefs into their identity. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that, to be honest. And one thing that I've been thinking about, because I was pretty keen on the whole social order idea, but last time that we spoke, but I've kind of done some thinking on it, and once upon a time, there were ideas that, if they were brought up, would disrupt the social order of society and groups, whatever it might be. For example, like being, homosexual or transgender or things like that in like a conservative household. Even nowadays, that's something that's extremely difficult and disruptive to the social order. But obviously, the only way that we can, have change in this world that's going to, reduce the suffering of people is by having these difficult conversations, even in moments where I feel like, it might be a bit inappropriate,
One thing I found interesting was after I shared that snap on Facebook, I only got 3 total reactions and
Really?
and 1 comment. Most people said that's too much information for me to read.
Yeah.
Which comes back to my original problem. We don't want to take the time or do the hard work to come to grips with the problems.
Right. Absolutely.
It's much easier to just, float on, as my boys over at Modest Mouse would say.
Yes. I was curious when you were saying that. I'm kind of shocked that you got any amount of backlash to a statement like that.
So I'll tell you what the comment was.
Shoot.
I love Socratic discourse, but it is questionable whether it is the only way of merit to dialogue. Just saying.
Really? Did that conversation go any further with that person?
I replied once. I've had back and forth with this guy on Facebook before. He's clearly very intellectually savvy, clearly smart, but he did not take the bait. And I thought it was clear in the post. I didn't say it was the only merit to dialogue. I said it was the only way to solve our biggest problems. Very different thing. There's tons of reasons to talk about tons of things without having to always get into Socratic discourse. And I think that's kind of what I want to come back to that because I think the biggest area where we've had rubs in our circles is places where people choose language in such a way that they're staking a claim, but then they don't want to actually be held to that claim. And they're like, well, look, man, it's an opinion. But they don't state it as one. They feel like they're objectively correct, but when they're pressed on it, they're like, well, I just like it. And they fall back to subjectivity as if you can just flip that switch. And that's where I tend to call foul and then make everyone hate me.
Well, you do so effectively, I can't say, as much as I like. A very effective method. But yeah, no, and I agree with this, and it's kind of something I've done a lot more talking on. One thing that I found to be really particularly annoying for people like us is when you get baited into conversations by those people, and then as soon as you start trying to provide an argument against their point, that's when they just decide to revert back to the opinion shield. And it's really, it sucks, because then you look like the asshole for trying to, you know, get to the truth of the matter and try and actually make logical, sound arguments, and then, you know, they just shit on you, you know? Like that's what I find really particularly annoying, is the opinion shield in social contexts.
Well, and let's be clear too, they do it about things for which there is no place to stand, that is just your opinion. There is a right or wrong answer to, you know, whether or not policing in America is systematically oppressive towards minorities. There is a right or wrong answer to whether or not our economic system is systematically oppressive towards minorities, and now it's just becoming systematically oppressive towards fucking everybody who's not Jeff Bezos at this point. And so there are right and wrong answers to these questions, and people want to argue as though they think that they're right, and then they throw up the opinion shield about something to which you don't get to have an opinion. And I think that's the biggest disagreement, or I should say the biggest problem that I see, is culturally and pop culture, how parents talk, how a lot of people talk, and even people who tend to be very, very adamant about a certain side of things. I've had a lot of people... See, I think the problem is like, let's even use the LGBTQ movement as an example here, just to clarify what I mean. There are times where their opinion and protecting their opinion has been convenient to get a temporary win in short order, rather than winning the argument, rather than winning the overall battle that will actually win the war. It's like, here's a temporary victory that we can get, because if I can get you to just respect that it's my opinion and then let it go, I can get some temporary relief. But underneath of it, you still might have your shitty opinion that's actually false and based on bad information. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's kind of why people are, well, it's like you were saying, why people are so hostile to counter arguments and things like that. It's because they are so desperately attached to this opinion of theirs that's part of their identity, that they're willing to defend it to any ends really necessary. And I suppose that's really the biggest issue, right? Is that people are more concerned with, you know, how they feel and how their opinion affects themselves. Well, not their opinion, their thoughts and, you know, beliefs affect themselves rather than others. And one thing that I found interesting earlier, and I feel like a sharper distinction should be drawn, is that between opinions and arguments. You know, I think what you said specifically was opinions are, you know, categorized as, you know, our subjective experience of something. That's what you described it as. Is that correct?
Well, I was saying opinion. The only thing that you can have a true opinion on is something that is purely subjective preference. So I prefer chocolate over vanilla. I prefer cooler temperatures rather than hotter temperatures. So, something like that. And I think that really almost everything else, other than something that's just a matter of your subjective opinion, everything else has a right or wrong answer. I'm pretty rigid on that philosophically.
Yeah, and I kind of agree with that point, and I think adding an example here might help too. I think a lot of people skip the line a little bit when they when we're talking about this, extremely important distinction here. When somebody says, for example, I really enjoy seafood or something like that. So that right there is an opinion. That's something that's based on subjective experience, harms nobody. But then there's some people who might jump over the line and say, and this is obviously low stakes compared to a lot of the other issues we're talking about. But then somebody might say seafood is good, and that is where you jump over the line, right? Like that's where you're starting to make an argument about something, whether it be little or big, and that's when we start to get into the argument territory. And I feel like a lot of people don't understand the distinction between I enjoy seafood and seafood is good. You know what I mean?
Well, yeah. And then what you have in those situations too is somebody will reliably come with the how can you not like seafood?
Exactly.
Because the biggest bias that we have overall, I think, is the one where other people's realities are like my own. I like
Yes.
it, therefore you'll like it. I, for a while, had talked to you about Breaking Bad, which I know you're almost through now.
I'm halfway through yet.
But
Well, halfway through season 5.
is it fair to say that the reason why you thought before that you might not have liked it is because people tried to sell it to you based on things that you didn't like and were things about the show that you wouldn't have liked until you saw it in a different light which actually fit your preferences? Is that fair?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, I didn't necessarily have any predispositions towards the show. It was more just like I'm not really interested in watching TV shows and stuff like that. But I mean, it's not like it particularly stood out of interest to me either. It's like I didn't have the experience of watching the show, so I didn't deem it important to watch the show. Right? Like
Well,
that's
and the
kind of
thing
the
is
difference.
what often happens is people sell something to somebody else and they don't know enough about them to find out what they like to see if it'll actually match up with what that person might like. Right? So it's like, oh, the show's awesome. It's got some really epic moments of violence. Well, I don't like epic moments of violence. That actually tends to turn me off from a show.
Yeah.
Turns out the show's not about those moments of violence. They're there to tell a story about characters. And the reason why I love the show is because of the psychological dive in that we actually get into the mind of a developing psychopath. In so that the moments of violence, I mean, if you want to watch that, there's all kinds of, ones that you can watch on it. Now, I'm mostly saying that to play devil's advocate. I actually do love that. John Wick is like one of my favorite movie series.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the problem is we tend to suggest things and we don't find out we're doing it based on what we like and what our preferences are. And we don't actually think about often if somebody else will like it based on other things and make those quality comparisons. And again, that's in the world of subjective enjoyment.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there. And I think it's specifically the experience you talked about that makes, you know, distinguishing opinions between arguments and facts very difficult for most people. Is that when you experience something firsthand and that kind of engraves into your memory and your brain, it's something that you become accustomed to and it shapes you and your beliefs in a lot of ways, and it makes it very difficult for you to understand other people. um for example, our good friend Mr. Calum, he was in the army, and that experience shaped a good amount of his beliefs, and that's what makes it hard for him to understand our beliefs, right? Neither of us were in the army or anything like that. And I think a lot of people have an emotional response to those experiences, and it makes it very difficult for them to let go of it.
Well, let me suggest something to you, and I'm just curious what your thought is, because I know how it was when I was growing up, and I feel like this is even more so now. I didn't develop this skepticism towards my own beliefs until I started having to resolve a whole bunch of cognitive dissonance and contradiction after contradiction when I became an adult in the real world and realized that a lot of my childhood beliefs and a lot of my childhood values, systems, ethics, or whatever just fell apart in the face of real life. Like the formulas didn't work. It just didn't get the results I wanted for myself, Yeah. And so I was forced into accepting this type of skepticism of your own beliefs. My thing is, what I think the biggest problem is, and I'd be curious what you think, because you're not quite a whole generation below me, but you're close, And I think this is getting worse as we get younger. We've made identities the important thing. We talk about it all the time, individualism and identity, and no one should question your identity or ever have anything to say about your identity. Your identity is the most sacred thing. And I feel like it's that doubling down on that makes people the most protective of their beliefs, even when they're wrong. And that's kind of what Galif's book is about. She's writing about this very thing where the bigger and more labels you are assigning to your identity, that's a collection of beliefs and values that are baked in there, which just means more stuff you're going to protect regardless of whether it's right or wrong. And I feel like that's getting worse as we get younger, because we have, I don't know if there's a name for it yet, but I mean, I feel like you could call the Gen Zs the don't talk about my weirdness generation. Like, everything is protected. You're never allowed to criticize anything. You can't bring anything up or ever challenge a single idea or belief that they have. So do you think I'm digging it? The real problem underneath of this is we're taught when we're younger that that's sacred and that should be protected.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's an accurate experience and thought to say here that, people in general, especially in my generation, are very protective of their beliefs. I have my theories as to why this might be the case, and obviously I'm not exactly certain on it. I think, the online space has really caused that to not caused, I don't want to say, but has had a great impact on that kind of mentality to some extent. Just, people being on social media and essentially creating labels for themselves almost as like a book cover to their life and to the type of person they are. Rather than being down in the trenches, with other people having conversations and trying to understand one another through actual dialogue, we exist in a space now where you can type anything you want, unhindered by anything else, and you can put out all of your thoughts into one area, and you don't have to be held responsible for those things as a result of the fact that they're not in front of you to punch you in the face. You know?
Oh, dude! And what's worse is you have no matter where you fall, other people that are in the same boat that don't want to deal with their shittiness, like their own personal shittiness, or address it, are right there to defend them. And I'm so glad you brought that up, because that was another thing that happened this week. I had a friend post on Facebook. I'm not even sure if I can call her a friend anymore after this conversation.
Oh boy.
It's kind of up to her.
Yeah.
Essentially what she said is, does anybody have any moron stories? And then what she followed up with was telling a story about going to Panera, ordering 3 bagels and 3 cream cheeses and paying for it. And then when she got to the end of the line, she got handed the 3 bagels and only 1 cream cheese. And she was like, hey, I ordered 3 cream cheeses. And the girl was like, yeah, I don't think we can do that. Whoever was behind the counter. And she was like, no, I paid for them. Like, I paid for 3 cream cheeses. And so this person said, Okay, well, I don't know about that, so I have to get my manager. And then what I found was 10 people who all have some similar personality types that you might assume. Many of them are anti-vax Trumpers. Many of them are like you can figure out what the personality cult around this type of criticism of an individual is. But they all were basically like, yeah, what a fucking idiot. And it's like, you have no idea why this person was skeptical of giving you the extra cream cheese. First of all, they're probably terrified to ever give out anything extra for fear of losing their job, because that's what, capitalism has done to us, right?
Yeah.
Everything comes down to the almighty dollar. So if you ever give away anything for free, you can get fired over that. And that's terrifying, because there goes your primary source of providing for you and your loved ones. And even upon pointing that out, just the fact that there were other people still willing to defend how shitty it was, for this particular person to say that and call this person a moron, even after I provided all these great examples, I was like, that person could be autistic and not understand certain social cues and have gotten that job. You don't know. You can't tell someone's autistic from the outside. There's a million things. How good would you feel if you just called an autistic person who's just trying to make a living a moron? And I got, well, they're not autistic. You don't know. You don't know.
It's like, I can't imagine that they're best friends with the person who was doing that.
Well, and then ultimately the eventual defense, which I thought was hilarious, was I didn't do anything mean because I didn't say it to them. I was just bullshitting with my friends on Facebook. What? Like, you're adults. Didn't you learn that talking about people behind their backs was fucked up, like, in the 7th grade? I would hope.
You would think so.
So yeah,
that's wild.
It's just like the internet allows people to not have. It's exactly like you said. I don't actually have to deal with the things that make me a shitty person, because all I need is actually just a bunch of people to back me up. So why think about anything critically when I can find enough people who are willing to? I mean, that to me fully explains how the Flat Earth movement blew up.
Right, absolutely. I mean, nowadays you have the choice to lock yourself in an echo chamber, whereas, in times where the internet wasn't a thing and you didn't get to necessarily choose everyone that you spent time with, like in a public setting, you couldn't do that. You had to come to grips with different ideas and different people. Nowadays, you can have any stupid belief you want and find people who will agree with you.
You've come to start to admire one of the great kings of rationality, Sam Harris, as much as I do.
Oh yeah.
And there's this moment where he was in a debate, and he's trying to point out, why it matters. Why it matters what you believe. And he's talking about this, and he's like, the biggest difference between religion and a lot of other similarly unjustified and stupid beliefs is just that there's enough people willing to believe it. And he points out, he's like, when somebody utters their sincere belief that Elvis Presley is still alive, they don't get very far in society because they are immediately met with ill-concealed laughter, and they immediately pay a price for that belief.
Yeah.
And they should,
Absolutely.
And that's the thing, is the internet removes that correcting mechanism because it allows people to find enough people to agree with, for the wrong reasons, your stupid idea. And now at that point it becomes tribal, right?
Right.
In fact, it kind of, just talking about it now, this actually came to me, kind of reminds me of what happened with Trumpism. Because if you watched the Republican side, almost everybody was like, we really don't want that guy to represent the Republican Party. But we think it's a good thing that he's in the race because he's challenging these other politicians But they still had at that time at least like hoped like somebody else would eventually win out the nomination. They just liked that Trump was forcing them to be a little less politician-y, you know?
Right.
Then what happens? Trump actually wins and now becomes the leader of your tribe. And so people all of a sudden dumb themselves down to the Trump level and accept certain patterns of behavior. I mean, this explains why Christians were excusing all kinds of very unchristian-like things in defense of Trump, because the tribalism becomes more important than the values. So that makes, I think that I'm saying that correctly.
No, 100%. I mean, people start to abandon their ideals when faced with a situation where it's where they feel like it's necessary, you know. And I had a thought in my mind here. I think that tribalism is something important that you brought up, because a lot of people talk about how the United States is so horribly polarized nowadays, and I think the tribalism caused by the internet, where you're able to lock yourself in echo chambers of unjustified beliefs, I think that's what's really escalated the issue. You know, is that we have a lot of people who don't have to tackle, you know, these ideas. They get to they just simply get to have them. And you know, when you battle them, I think that's one thing that I have the biggest issue with where we're at right now, is that battling them is considered like, you know, almost improper, unpolite, rude. You know, having these conversations and trying to get to the truth of the matter, we've demonized it.
Oh, absolutely. Well, and actually, you just made me remember something too. Because you and I both have somewhat of a distaste for a particular brand of leftist opinion show. And that would be Sam Cedar.
Yep. Not a fan.
Not a fan. I mean, I'll occasionally, you know, if he's bringing up something that I'm not hearing somewhere else that I think is interesting. Young Turks. Used to be good. Trash now, you know?
Yeah.
And there's more that we could point to, but a big part of the problem is they are very tribal about how they approach problems. You know, and I didn't really think about this, but it's one of my biggest problems with identity politics. People on the left don't realize when they're committing the same evil they're fighting against. They're very, very bad about noticing that. They're willing to call it out in another camp, right? So perfect example is Neil deGrasse Tyson talked about this in one of the most awesome moments. He's like, you know, people on the left, they love to call the people on the right science deniers. They're science deniers about climate change and vaccines, and science deniers about these things, and they're not willing to call out their own science denial in their camp, which is astrology, healing crystals,
Yeah.
you know, mystical energy, right? You got a lot of those leftists, we'll call them the Marianne Williamson Club, where, you know, there's a whole lot of spooky stuff that's getting talked about. None of it's justified. None of it makes any sense. But no one wants to call it out because they're on my team, and I don't want to lose people on my team or risk them joining the other team.
Yeah.
That's the wrong approach. Like, that's gonna fuck us over in the long run.
Well, and you know what else I think is the wrong approach, is something you brought up, is viewing it as a matter of teams. I think oftentimes we go into these conversations and we have to assume that there's multiple different sides, which I think is destructive to dialogue in a number of ways. But really what it comes down to is that there is a whole wide spectrum of beliefs that can be had about any issue that you really list. And when we form it into teams, we often, you know, change the script a little bit. We make it so that it's a dichotomy of one versus the other, rather than, you know, discussing the wide variety of beliefs at play here. And that kind of results in almost both camps that we have called them being wrong and veering further from the truth. You know, both the Democrats and the Republicans is the dichotomy in this country. Both sides have these issues. Both sides have, you know, science deniers and people who, you know, don't care to seek the truth. And I think that's the issue, is we throw all of these beliefs out the window.
Well, and so I know one of the biggest recent clashes that I really wanted to bring up because it's one that you and I feel very, very strongly about, and a lot of people don't realize how much it impacts what they think of. It ties back to that conversation that I had about the calling the person an idiot at Panera or a moron or whatever. Ultimately, that conflict comes down to free will.
Oh yeah.
Because why do some people think it's okay to make fun of other people for their brain capacity? Well, on some level, you think it's a choice to be an idiot. The moment you realize the truth of determinism, no one's an idiot. Like, there are just minds that were a product of their genes and environment and were caused by things that were beyond their choices. Therefore, like, you can't be an idiot. There's always a cause for why you did something that seems idiotic, that is fully explainable, that was through no choice of your own, therefore no fault of your own. And so ultimately what you believe about free will come down to whether or not you'll actually show compassion for this person making an honest mistake. Or another thing, they didn't choose the conditions of capitalism where someone's terrified to ever accidentally give something extra away for free.
Right. And I think that's, if there were ever going to be a dichotomy where we could definitively say there are two sides to the issue, there is the truth and then there is not the truth. And I think that's one thing that a lot of people don't understand, because they think that their truth is the truth a lot of the time. They think that their belief is just as valid as anything else, and therefore there's their truth versus non-truths. And that's not how we get to the root of the issue, right? It's we have to find truth amongst the rubble of all the various beliefs. And I think that's the only dichotomy that would be effective here. And you're absolutely right on the free will thing. I think that's, if there's any fundamental issue that I think is probably the most important that we solve first when trying to get everybody on the same page, is that one. That's a huge one.
Yeah, because it does lie underneath what most people think about ethics. A lot of people don't realize that religious ethical systems, even if they don't completely adhere to it, on some level they come back to divine command theory.
Yeah.
And divine command theory necessarily relies on the free will assumption that God gave us free will and then set up rules, and then what's right or wrong is how you make choices based on that. Because if we can't willfully choose to follow his commands, that is a big problem for the whole concept of divine command theory. So you can pretty much throw out divine command theory the second you throw out free will. Which is also part of why a lot of the people that have debated for it in the philosophy circles, the William Lane Craigs of the world, the Jordan Petersons of the world, the reason they want to protect the free will thing so much is because they know that that's the real game in town. That's the real problem.
Right, absolutely. Well, and even then, once we solve the free will question, that also, necessarily creates some level of empathy, right? Because we understand that people do the things they do and think the way they do for very, based on their circumstances. They don't choose to think that they don't choose to think these things and believe these things. And so we're not going to, dismiss somebody for the way that they think, right?
Listen, I will give you $10,000 right now if you can believe that I am actually a cyborg from the future, pretending to be Alex Waite, host of Average People Talking. 10 grand.
And that's a 10 grand I lose. That's a 10 grand I lose.
Doesn't that suck?
I can pretend to think about it.
Exactly. You need some evidence.
Absolutely.
We can't do it. You can't just choose a belief because you fucking feel like it. Wouldn't that be nice?
Exactly. And that's kind of why So coming back to the first thing that I had brought up in this conversation, what makes and I think it's an important one revolving this discussion, because obviously, it is very accurate to say that politics and other related topics are very divisive and corrosive to social discourse to some extent, right? Like it can cut ties between friends, and it can end friendships. This.
And let's be clear, the reason is because of the fact that we got raised to protect our identities and be a soldier, rather than to be skeptical of all of our beliefs and hold nothing as sacred, right? Like, this is taught. It's taught that you should lose friends over this.
Absolutely. And so what I'm kind of curious to hear about from you is, in a world where free will doesn't exist, and we've dealt with this topic, how can we, how can we be sure that everybody is capable of finding the truth?
Well, you can't. And not everyone is. There is the problem of genuine cognition differences. However, this is another thing that Julia Galef talks about in her new book, which, again, I gotta repeat. The book is called The Scout Mindset. It's available on Amazon. It's one of the best books of 2021, in my opinion. Highly recommend.
You'll have to send me all of that just so I remember it.
Yeah.
Is it an audiobook?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure she has an audiobook for it. I'll have to look. I'll be honest, I'm not picking up the book because I've watched so much of her content. She's done a number of podcasts that I'm pretty sure I'm not going to learn anything in that book that I haven't already heard her say.
Right.
But the book is a great, you know what? I'm sure I'll have time with all my driving. I am going to pick it up at some point. Yeah.
Yeah, me too.
Even I'm sure there'll be a little something, if anything else, better ways to talk about it, because I think it's important. But just to come back to it, there's not a link between intelligence and the ability to go through this process. Let's be clear about that. You can be very, very low in IQ and still understand the tenets of how Socratic discourse works and what the difference between a justified true belief is, what knowledge is versus just your belief and faith, right?
Right.
That does not require an IQ score. Now, given the free will problem, what you have is you might have too many layers that aren't able to be stripped away because you're so far removed from somebody and they've been so trained not to trust you that you could never earn enough trust to actually sway them. But it does come down to being a trusted source of information, which I kind of talked about that in the show opener, right? There are people who have come to basically say, I can't hear it from you because you're not an expert. Well, okay, perfect example, case with my dad. I suggested to him, I said, here's a guy who went to the Moody Bible Institute, Wheaton College, and then Princeton Seminary. 3 different Bible colleges. A guy who believes or believed exactly as you do for forever, but he wrote a book on the contradictions in the Bible and why they're problematic and why pastors don't talk about them. I was like, the best book for you to start with because it just deals with the Christian story, not the Old Testament, which has vastly more contradictions, but they're easier to dismiss for Christians because that's the old Jewish stuff. That's not the part that actually matters to me, right? And I was like, you should read Jesus Interrupted. Jesus Interrupted is basically all of the contradictions in the Gospels cataloged by this author. So that book is by, oh gosh, I can't think of his name. I got to pull it up. But anyways, Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman. We're talking about a guy with 3 different fucking Bible degrees. If anybody knows the Bible, it's Bart Ehrman. Right. If anyone knows the history of the Bible, it's Bart Ehrman. My dad read it for an hour and then turned around and said, well, it's clear that this guy doesn't understand what Jesus was trying to say. No, what this guy is saying is no one understands what Jesus is trying to say because Jesus doesn't say the same thing on 2 different chapters that are supposed to be about the same story.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
He literally contradicts himself, Dad. Like, that's the point of the book, is that the Jesus character you're talking about is not consistent. And therefore is illogical, which means can't exist. At least not as it's written, you know? My dad couldn't get more than an hour into it. So I think there are TFGs, too far gones. They even a source like that can't garner enough trust. He believed somewhere deep down, Bart Ehrman went through all the trouble of going to 3 Bible colleges and going to church 3 times a week to actually secretly be wanting to do the work of the devil that whole time. Well, I don't know how to talk to a person like that.
Right, and I guess that's kind of why I ask, is because is this search for truth and the battle against the opinion shield a fruitless endeavor?
I definitely don't think it's fruitless because I do think everyone at bottom has a desire to not be wrong. And I think that's the motivation that we can play with. But it is very clear to me that until we seriously do something about social media, like that's the big battle, for sure.
Oh, yeah.
Because social media, kind of like you said, removes or creates most of the barriers that stop us from getting through to people.
Right. We live in a world where people no longer have to take responsibility for how shitty they are as a person. You know, like, people don't have to take responsibility for their shitty beliefs, take responsibility for their destructive, thoughts and actions. Like, people don't have to do that anymore because they are behind a computer screen, and we've decided that is the realm of not, like, you can't touch that. As soon as somebody puts it on the internet, you no longer get to do anything about that, Whereas, like, if you're in person, if it's super egregious, you punch them in the face,
Yeah, only 2 paths out of the conflicts, right? Conversation or violence. And sometimes, sometimes throughout history, violence ends up being the erupting result. Now, where I'd say that has failed us in the long run is violence has saved capitalism at every turn. Anytime someone tries to make a genuine challenge on capitalism, the capitalists have more money and power and resources and just use violence to keep their system going. And then say, look, every time somebody tries the other one, it doesn't work. And it's like, yeah, it's because you fucking killed them.
And that comes down to the free will thing again. Capitalism wouldn't be as appealing if we lived in a world where we've resolved that for everybody.
Yeah, true.
You know what I mean? If everybody, like, we have fooled everybody into thinking that you can be whatever you want in this world.
And that merit is a real concept.
Exactly.
You should be merited for the work that you do. Well, what does it mean? What does that mean? Because without the free will view, you really deserve no credit for your accomplishments. And that's the one that people really don't like. That's the thing. That's the protection. That's where their protective biases comes in, and they want to throw up their wall.
Right. It doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel good to know that your accomplishments are nothing but a product of your culmination. Like, that's a hard thing to come to grips with. I get it. And that's why I guess it's almost like difficult.
I guess where I find my hope, to come back to your question, is my hope is that our desire to not be false is larger than those more temporary pleasures. Does that make sense? I think that's where our hope has to lie. And so I do think that's one thing, is a lot of conversations I do try to get back to the basics and try to get down to the fundamentals and then build from there. I almost try to take the Descartes approach. Descartes famously realized a bunch of his beliefs were false, You know, he was contemplating on the fact that we believe Santa Claus when we're young, don't when we're older. You know, things like that. Like those kinds of problems where we know we had a false belief when we're young, and then we realize later on. And if very simple, very valuable beliefs to us are so easily flipped or incorrect, couldn't it be that we're wrong about almost everything? And this really freaked Descartes out. He went on an existential crisis. And so what did he do? He ripped everything out and started with the most basic thing he could think. I think, therefore I am. The lights are on. And I have to start there. Now, where Descartes went wrong was his very next thing was like, and then God. Maybe not, buddy. You know, but, you know.
Yeah, maybe not. Right. I mean, I totally agree with that. And that's, if there's any lie that I'm willing to live, assuming it is a lie, it's the lie that there is hope for us in finding the truth as a human race.
Yeah, I'm with you.
That's where I'm at.
Yeah, it's the only time where I'm an optimist. One might say it's the only thing stopping me from being an all-out nihilist. To be honest,
it's the only thing, right? Yeah, like it's
most
if
days
we don't have this hope, you know.
Most days, Alex is pretty nihilistic.
Absolutely.
Days. But I do so. Insofar as it's instructional for what to do in these conversations, I think it's always trying to find out how basic our disagreement is.
Yes.
And to do that, I think one of the best things you can do is ask if your person who's disagreeing with you is doing so in good faith. And there's a number of ways to do that. I mean, you can do it directly, right?
But yeah, like just straight up asking them, like, do you care to have your opinion changed? Or, well, not your opinion, but do you care to have your belief changed?
Well, but even then, they'll say no. But if they're being honest and in good faith, that, like, I guess what I mean is, you can ask them in a way that's favorable to them, right? Like, listen, you know, we could have been having that conversation with Caleb, and this is where I fail in conversations, I think, okay? And you could go, Caleb, are you presenting that because you really believe it's true down to your toes? And if you really do believe that it's true, can you at least grant me that I'm disagreeing with you because of the same reason, and we both are just in a good faith pursuit of truth? And if you can at least get to that agreement on the goal, that's a pretty basic level to start at. And then it's like, let's go up from there. And instead of what we do is we start with the top level, and then people just get frustrated as we get down to the middle before we ever get to the bottom. So I think like reversing the order of it and starting as basic as we can of where we agree instead of at where we disagree. Does that make sense?
Starting from the bottom up is always the best, as they say.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, maybe the only thing we agree on is we both want what's true. And after that, it's like, I think I'm Alex and you think I'm, you know, a time-traveling bunny rabbit from the movie Donnie Darko. Well, okay. We got a lot of work to do. But at least I know we're both pursuing the truth.
Well, and even then, we don't necessarily know because they could just be lying. But
yeah, we can't know. We can't know. But if I'm willing to take anything on faith, kind of like you said, I'll roll with that one because it's the only thing stopping me from abject nihilism.
Absolutely.
And I don't want to be a nihilist.
Me neither. Being a nihilist
seems bad.
That's like the last barrier of hope between us and complete nihilism is just hoping that everyone cares enough to find the truth.
Suddenly this turned into a Nickelback song. I don't know how I feel about that.
Oh, man.
Coco Goat says it's an exhausting mindset.
Oh, yeah.
And it is, and that's part of why I mean, let's be honest about it. I think you and I would agree with this. The reason to avoid nihilism isn't necessarily because nihilism isn't true. It's for selfish motivations. Nihilism requires probably more energy than being optimistic at some level. And is more self-destructive. So for my own self-preservation, I'll choose the non-nihilistic approach. Even though I'm accepting that nihilism might be correct. There may be no actual meaning to life.
Right. Well, and that's kind of the unique position we're in as a society, is that there are fundamental questions that could mean, like, the answer to those questions that we don't have yet could mean the difference between complete nihilism and living in a world where we can be optimistic and be sure of ourselves, you know?
Definitely one of the things I find fascinating is how easily we could have gotten that answer already. You know, it could have been that splitting the atom was as easy as throwing sand in a microwave, in which case nihilism would have been correct.
Right.
Because none of us are still here if that's true.
Yeah.
There's enough crazies in the world that are just going to be willing to microwave the sand.
Oh, man. Well, we're lucky insofar as that, I suppose.
This is probably going to get me in trouble on Twitch, but interestingly enough, most of them live in places with lots more sand than we have.
Oh, my. No. Oh, man.
I mean, to be fair, these people want the apocalypse. And by these people, I mean diehard Muslims. And Christians.
I mean, he's not wrong.
They embrace... My parents... This is the thing a lot of people don't understand about diehard religious people. My parents cannot fucking wait for Revelations. Like, if it was tomorrow, they'd be like, yes, look at all of you people dying. I will ascend.
Yeah.
That's what's fucked up about it.
I think that's one interesting thing that makes it, like... It honestly makes it even more difficult, especially when dealing with religious people in terms of this topic, is that they have convinced themselves of this wondrous afterlife that is said to be better than the life that we are in. So, like, what do they have to fucking lose, dude? Even if they were being completely dishonest and didn't give a shit about the truth, when they die, they're just going to be in an eternal, beautiful place anyways, as far as they know.
And again, this comes back to the problem of philosophical disagreements, even inside the camp of the left, is it's like, if I can't get you to understand that the belief in the afterlife is the number one direct motivation for someone to become a suicide bomber, and you can't believe that and agree with that and accept that, and you want to say it's geopolitics and economics and all this bullshit, like, on some level, yes, those contribute to people having a miserable enough life that they start going, you know, strapping that bomb on doesn't seem too bad today. Sure. But it doesn't explain the dude who randomly just leaves his perfectly good life in the middle of Norway to go join ISIS. And that was a real thing that was happening. Because those ideas are more compelling than people on the left want to admit. Because, again, it comes down to a philosophical difference about the nature of reality. When you actually believe that the universe was created rather than, you know, the correct belief, which is agnosticism. I don't know if the universe was created or not. We can't know. We're not sure. We don't have any method possible, no reasonable level of argument ever given as to whether or not the universe was created, you know. But these people are like, nah, give me your Big Bang. I just think I know who banged it. And by the way, he wants me to kill myself with like 5 of you so I can go get 72 virgins. I'm out. That's perverse. Like, that's the real disagreement we have to solve for, and everything else is just trimming around the edges.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we smacked it on the head, I think. It's
brutal.
I think another thing, like, you know, living in a first world country also kind of clouds our judgment a little bit when it comes to just how destructive these these philosophical disagreements can be. You know what I mean? Like when we live in a place where, we're relatively shielded from from crime, poverty, and all, relatively horrible things, you know, how could we even understand the measure and the extent at which, poorly held beliefs can affect society as a whole, even at an individual level?
All right. So, Coco Goat in chat just brought up something I am really excited that you brought up, because this was another
Oh boy.
bit of an argument that I may or may not have gotten into just in the past week.
Here we go.
Coco Goat says, yeah, I personally am agnostic. Agnostic with regards to what? I'm going to go ahead and make the assumption that you mean agnostic in regards to a belief about a God. Because that's what a lot of people use, that identity label. And this was another one where I got frustrated, because agnostic is a word, in my opinion, that was born out of the opinion shield. It was born out of the idea that there are two sides to that debate, and it's a matter of, on some level, there's not a right or wrong answer to whether or not there's a God. And beyond that, what I feel the most strongly about, and I'm sure Coco God will be curious if this actually moves you at all, okay? If someone suggests there's a Santa Claus, you either do or don't believe in the Santa Claus. If, wow, live on stream, Bob Saget has passed away, apparently.
Really?
It's a big rip.
Big rip to
Bob
Saget.
A lot of love for Mr. Saget. That's sad. So the thing is, my problem with the word agnostic, and I guarantee you, I get more pushback about this topic. I hate it. In fact, I hate the term atheist. I use it because it's useful for other people to instantly get an idea about what I believe. But let me suggest that if someone presents something like Gremlins, a flying spaghetti monster, or a Santa Claus, just because they proposed those mythological creatures to you does not mean you're suddenly agnostic about their existence. I'm not agnostic about a flying spaghetti monster. I'm certain one does not exist. I don't ever use the word agnostic, because unless I'm talking about something that we can't know, that is as far removed from religion as possible, like a scientific claim. So, for example, I'm agnostic as to whether or not there are consciousnesses beyond my own. I don't think I can actually know if anything else is conscious. I know for sure I'm conscious, but I don't think I can know. I don't think no amount of science advancement, I think we can get really good guesses, and I think I have really good reason to believe that other things are conscious, but I can't know. Does that make sense? Liam, are you following me here?
Yeah, and I guess I'm a little bit turned around on it, right? Because what is the term agnostic even really defined as when people typically use it? Like a lack of belief in God, or a...
Not sure if there is one or not. So Gnostic is like to have knowledge. So if I claimed to be a Gnostic atheist, it would mean I know that there is positively no God. Well, my problem with those words being put together is I can't be Gnostically anti anything. Like, how can you prove a not truth? You can't prove a negative assertion like that. You have to have significant parameters around something to be able to prove the absence of it. It has to be able to put in a box, right? So, for example, if you ask me, right, if there are if there is a hidden planet inside of Mount Rushmore. Gnostically, I can say that I'm certain there is not a hidden planet inside Mount Rushmore.
Sure, but like, so that's obviously a provable statement. I mean, we can just open up Mount Rushmore with dynamite or whatever you might suggest, and we can see very clearly that there is no planet inside.
Whose
Mount
face
Rushmore.
should we start with, though?
Which face do we? I don't know. I mean, I guess you kind of blow up all of them with. Is this the
dealer's choice? It just doesn't matter.
Yeah, I'd probably like roll a d4 or something because I'm a nerd. But
roll a d4. Me personally, I think I'm going Washington. To be honest.
Yeah, I think that's a fair one.
I'd rather keep Jefferson and Teddy and Lincoln.
Yeah, because George was like the first one to really be the head of the mess. The guys just had to deal with it after. So I mean,
yeah,
can at least
seems principled. Yeah,
but I guess with that is obviously I don't think anybody, who's being intellectual and honest with themselves would agree that the existence of a god is provable nor disprovable, right? Like you can't.
Well, but the thing is once again, I could take that same language game you're playing and apply it to Gremlins or the Flying Spaghetti Monster. Give any being with sufficient supernatural so-called characteristics, and I could say, well, I can't prove or disprove its existence. Well, okay, but you're the one who made it up. So if you're going to bring it up, it's on you to provide evidence. I'm not agnostic about Gremlins. I'm not agnostic about a Santa Claus, and I'm certain as hell not agnostic about the Flying Spaghetti Monster. I don't think they're there because you brought it up and haven't provided any evidence of their existence. So,
Right, and I guess that's why, words at the end of the day, it's like the definitions game. I think the clear distinction, right, is that agnosticism is the belief that there could or could not be one, whereas atheism is the lack of belief in one. Am I correct in saying that?
So atheism is the lack of belief in one because, but to be clear, we don't say that I definitely believe there is no God. No one can say that.
Right.
What it means is no evidence has ever been put forward, no argument has ever been made, no reasons has ever been provided sufficient enough for me to generate a belief in one. But I don't need the word. The word
right.
Atheist and the word agnostic were both designed to shift the burden of proof away from the person making up the bullshit.
Right, and so I think both. I don't even. Right. Oh, okay. Yeah, we're on the same page about this one because words at the end of the day are utility for other people to understand us.
Correct.
And the I see the dichotomy here. I agree. It's just I agree with you, especially on the statement that both words are particularly difficult to deal with when you're deep into philosophical rabbit holes that we are in. Good rabbit holes. But rabbit holes.
Well, and again, it comes back to the problem. The only reason either of the words exist is because the belief on the other side of those coins is so prevalent. But that's exactly why I think the words actually did us a disservice rather than a service. Because atheist is easy to attack. Agnostic is easy to attack. It's a lot harder to actually turn around and have to justify your God belief. Turns out it's never been done successfully, ever, once. It falls to counter argument every single fucking time because it's nonsense.
Yeah.
So
I'm on the same page on that matter.
That's the point, I think, at the bottom of all this and kind of where we can bring this to a close. That's true for every other major societal conflict. Whether or not there's a God, whether or not you have a right to private property. There's a counter argument to private property that's held up for literally centuries now.
Yes.
And yet people don't want to deal with that. We just mosey about our lives as though that didn't happen.
Yeah. Well, and I think even bringing it all the way back to the opinion shield as well, how you were kind of talking about the burden of proof, I think we oftentimes deal with a problem in our society where people put like they bring up their dog shit opinions, as they like to call them, their opinions. They bring up an argument that is unjustified, and then because they have done that, they then, when you counter them, they put the burden of proof on you to then challenge their unjustified belief. And then they revert back to the opinion shield. It's
And the second you're able to do it, literally the moment you're able to do it, it's like, well, it's my opinion.
Right.
Like, fuck off.
And that's the true hallmark of a bad argument, and a true hallmark that you have won the discussion, if there is a winner and a loser. In a world where everybody's using opinion shields, we are all losers until we decide to do something about it.
Yeah. Very good point. Very good point.
That was good stuff, though.
Yeah. I think I almost feel like today's a good day to end on a Harris clip.
Yes, Harris clip.
So let me pull up a very specific one.
I love me some Harris clip. I still haven't gotten a chance to get all the way through the moral landscape yet.
It is a meteor one, dude. Like I definitely don't. I'm not blind to that by any means.
Yeah.
I lost in my live screen.
You know what? I actually just picked up on audiobook recently on another note.
What's
completely
that?
Personal and totally irrelevant to the point. I picked up A Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking's.
Oh, nice, dude.
I've heard that's a real good one.
I've heard that is a great one.
I'm looking forward to it. I still need to finish the moral landscape, and then I can get onto that one. But
all right, stream will have to tell me if this is audible enough. But let's flip this on, and this is a good one.
Do you want to stream it to me, or you want me to watch the stream?
I'll stream it to you.
I want to see it too.
I'll stream it to you here.
Need me some big boy Sam Harris in my life.
This is one of my all-time favorite. This is just a collection of the times he went full comedian, but this first one is fantastic. Here we go.
Oh, what about all the good moods? I mean, can you still love people while viewing them as part of this vast fabric of causality? And I find that there is no sacrifice to the good stuff. I mean, it's not. First of all, things have to be sort of situationally appropriate. I'm not constantly looking at my daughter thinking about she's just a part of the physical universe and wow, neurotransmitters giving rise to all this cuteness. I mean, that's not the mode I'm in.
That's funny.
Let me give you a.
This is the one. This is the one.
Having this conversation. I mean, it seems to me we could have been having this conversation 500 years ago. And life was difficult 500 years ago. There was a lot of despair. There were crops failed and disease spread and people suffered just instantaneous and catastrophic changes in their fortune. And it was the cause of all of this actually was well understood 500 years ago. It was witchcraft. Imagine what it would be like to be among the 5 or the 10% of people at most who recognize that the very belief in magic, the very belief in witchcraft, the very belief in good witches or bad witches was a malignant fantasy. Imagine the kind of criticism you're going to get. No, your problem is just with kind of fundamentalist witchcraft. The reality is that witchcraft is far more nuanced than that, and there's no conflict between science and witchcraft. I mean, science deals with physical law and physical causality, but witchcraft deals with potent spells and the internal connections between things.
When I'm looking at you right now.
Oh my God.
Yeah. What's the comeback for that?
There is none.
No.
There is none.
No, it's just like...
That's a conversation ender.
You're done, skis. So, Coco wanted me to come...
Good.
Yeah, wanted me to come back to Opinion Shield and critical race theory. I'm specifically going to address Kendi because I think he's the biggest problem. He's the biggest problem because he's got the most celebrity, number one. Number two, he's got the best-selling books. And number three, he routinely, and I mean routinely, commits the same crime. He has been asked on any one of a dozen shows for people to, in good faith, debate and disagree with him. Most importantly, Coleman Hughes went out of his way to write a full New York Times piece. A New York Times piece. Basically giving respect and credit to Kendi, but kindly asking him to come justify his points regarding, there's no such thing as not racist. The thing is, at some level, critical race theory breaks down. Where I currently believe that level is at economic systems. I think the fundamental oppression of races is actually at the higher level, which is the fundamental oppression of capitalism. Because capitalism dictates that resource-rich societies with stable leadership and stable governments are going to oppress less resource-rich societies because we're not striving towards classless, stateless, moneyless, equal exchange of organized labor to create the things that we mutually, collectively want, right? The communist side. Instead, capitalism dictates that, we turn resources into products which gain profit for good. Well, those countries that win the capitalism game are likely to have one dominant race. That's just really kind of makes sense, right? I mean, there tends to be a dominant race in every society. Well, obviously, the dominant race in America was white. We clearly won capitalism. There's no doubt about that. We had the best resources and had, generally speaking, the most stability, and were able to defend our borders because our borders are fucking awesome. Like, the only reason why we were able to do that is really just being here is pretty good. You got a couple oceans protecting you on either side. Canada's not going to do shit. Mexico isn't a threat, so you're fine. You never, ever have to defend your own survival and your own resources for, 2 centuries. Meanwhile, you're able to just constantly win the capitalism game and be exporting far more than you're importing and be making vastly more profit on those exports. And really, it wasn't until somewhat recently that started to fail. And that, again, hasn't really mattered because we went to the global economy and tech and everything else, and we're winning that. So all this comes back to, all that happens before the oppression of a race by a society. Like, that's at a more top-line level. And those societies exploited labor. Now, what's fundamentally true about critical race theory is that there was a disparity in the races based on slavery and capitalism. That disparity was never resolved. Therefore, anything that we do now is simply perpetuating the original sin. Like, that's all true, But what the level that's higher than that, to me, philosophically, is the real original sin is this private property problem in the first place. And so my problem is when I press somebody who's really like all they ever focus on is identity and CRT, is they will tend to come back at me with everything that I just said is my opinion. Like, it's just your opinion that capitalism and money is what caused all this problem. And really, like, no, like, prove to me that it's not. Like, I've clearly demonstrated my reasons for why I think this, and it's not even a hard argument to follow. Again, capitalism necessitates that resource-rich societies will win over less resource-rich societies, especially factored in for political stability, and those societies will tend to be a majority of one race. Like, hello? You know? I don't see a whole lot of people pointing out that, in general, there's an overall oppression of Africa from the entirety of the Western world. Where's your CRT in that? Because that's true. Right now, today, we are fucking over dozens of countries, mostly made up of non-white people, okay, on a vaccine. And why are we doing that? Because Pfizer and Moderna want to make profit as much as they possibly can and refuse to give up international patent protections on that vaccine. Therefore, it becomes an international crime if those countries synthesize and start producing that vaccine on their own. Anybody have a problem with that? Where's Ibram X. Kendi to talk about that? You see, that's too complicated. That's too high of a level, and it doesn't make you famous or get you rich. So we don't want to talk about it. And that's where the opinion shield comes back in to protect somebody like Ibram Kendi, is anybody who does want to counter argue against him, he can always just go, well, the only reason you're arguing against me is because you're anti-racist, or because you're racist. Because I've already stated that if you're not anti-racist, then you're racist, because there's no such thing as not racist. And after that, anything that disagrees with me is I don't have to deal with because of my opinion shield. So I don't know if that's a good synopsis, Coco, for you of how the opinion shield protects somebody like Ibram Kendi. But anything that you would criticize on that, Liam?
No, I think that's completely valid. I'm kind of in the same camp with you on those issues, honestly. And you know, I think one person that I encourage you to look at, Coco Goat, especially if you live in the United States and you care about the future of our leadership, please check out Andrew Yang. He tackles a lot of these big overarching issues, and I think when we look at the larger issues, that's when we solve the micro problems that everybody's concerned about. You know, we got to start big and get smaller later, you know.
Yeah, we can't even figure out how much racism exists in America right now. Yes, Forward Party, you got it.
Yes.
That's awesome.
No, don't say sorry, Caps. Don't say sorry, Caps.
Yeah,
we love the Forward Party here at APT.
For sure, absolutely. So, like, perfect example is I don't think we can parse how much racism, like true, genuine racism of, like, groups of individuals running powerful systems, intentionally rigging the system against people of a particular race. I don't even think we can figure out how much of that is happening or would happen until we balance out the economic system so that everyone has access to the means of survival. If everyone had access to the means of survival, then we could sift for the rubble and find the inequalities and the inequities, right? But we can't even do that because the biggest inequity that exists is from those with privileges against those without privileges. And that all comes down to property and capital. Property and capital. People don't like that that's where it comes down from, but it really is, in my opinion. And my opinion is based on really sound philosophy that, again, has existed for hundreds of years that we're content to ignore in modern American society. But the other socialist countries, people are like, oh, why doesn't the UK have a bigger problem with racism? Well, I mean, they have a problem with racism, But it's minimized vastly because their social safety net is so good and so vast and so robust that it eliminates a lot of those tensions. The poorest places in America are the most racist. That should point to that should be evidence enough to point to this, if that makes sense. So, I think
Yeah,
that concludes my rant on that. But what were you gonna say, Liam?
a guy. I was just gonna say a guy I worked with named Andy. He, he had a lot of very poorly held beliefs and things that I disagreed with. But one thing that he said that I am fully on board with is it all comes back to money, dude. Especially in this country, that's a problem that we need to solve first, and then it all trickles down from there. Especially with race.
No doubt. Absolutely no doubt. Which is why we got to get a universal basic income fucking ASAP. And you know what?
That's why.
And you know what? Before we do that, can we get another stimmy?
No fucking kidding, dude. I could use another stimmy. Damn.
Biden, you hear me, dog? I want another stimmy.
Any Bidens in chat? Any Bidens? Hello?
I was a Biden bro for like 5 minutes when we left Afghanistan. It didn't last long.
I can't imagine. Sleepy Uncle Sleepy Joe.
Yeah, he's just absolutely fucking shit the bed at every other possible opportunity and absolutely deserves his crashing approval rating.
Potentially, literally. Shitting the bed.
All right. With
That was
that,
a good stream.
I think we'll call it a stream for the night. Liam, as always, thanks for coming on. It was a lively discussion. I appreciate you.
Thanks for having me, man. Always a good time to be on here.
You bet. You bet. And
Chat, have a good night. Always good seeing your lovely faces.
we'll put the
not seeing your faces, but-
end screen up for about 15 seconds so that everybody can come follow all my social media. Follows, likes, subscribes. It helps everywhere across the board. YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and obviously